So Ted Kaczynski died a couple days ago. More notoriously known, I think, as the Unabomber.
He hung himself.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I see no reason to doubt that narrative. I know we've been conditioned to think that
yeah. Everything's fake.
Yeah, everybody was suicided. Everything's fake. But yeah, that's the thing. He's dead. We were all alive in the 90s. I don't know. Do you guys remember this kind of, like, I remember it happening. It was like a weird time. People
I do.
Talking about
I heard about it.
Mailing pipe bombs, and it was
I think
crazy.
It's kind of interesting. Like, we could talk about the terrorist stuff, but to set him up, I think it's interesting to talk a little bit how this guy was, as a young kid, was pretty fucking sharp.
Oh, I'm getting there.
Okay, yeah,
I'm
get there. Because, like,
so
let him go. Let him cook, baby.
Yeah. Right. So, yeah, just want to make sure people know what happened. Like, I think he killed 3 people, maimed like another 20 or 25 or something like that. It was a big deal.
It was
back
fucked
in the day.
up.
He went uncaught for like 15 years or something.
I think 20 years. He was like living in a cabin in the wood, not even like a cabin.
Do you remember that like drawing of him with the hood on and the sunglasses?
Yeah,
that was
crazy.
Like fucking everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, he basically, I think, told the papers at the time that if you publish my manifesto, I will stop mailing bombs. And there was this whole thing like, should we give in to the
we were held hostage to his manifesto.
Yeah, we're going to negotiate with a terrorist or whatever, and ultimately it was published. But at the time, I remember being a kid, and everybody was like, just, this man's a psychopath, he's crazy, don't read it, don't even think about it, it's a lunatic mailing people bombs. And what he did was obviously very terrible. I am not advocating for mailing people pipe bombs.
Fucked up.
Very fucked up. Fucked up. But today, I actually did read his manifesto for the first time. It's like a 58-page.
Yeah, we want to explore the ideas of
so I would like
activities.
to separate like the actions of the man, which are undoubtedly like deplorable and like just horrific, with like what happened in there, and try to, because we like to try to delve into some like messy gray nuance on this show.
Can I also add in, like, I agree, because that was my initial intent, was to separate the ideas from the man. But then as I read more and more, I began to recombine them, and I was like, hold on, no, this, like, the man, like, his motives and his ideas do intersect. So like I don't want to just completely separate them, because I'm like very conflicted here, because ultimately guy was fucked up, ideas are good, but let's continue.
Yeah, like,
by the way, had you guys read the manifesto?
No, I hadn't read
today?
it before.
I had read the fucking headlines of the manifesto, which is another gripe of mine. I had not read the manifesto. The gripe I have with that is that those have a mismatch.
Yeah, like I knew at a high level that he was sort of like anti-technology and its impact on society. That was like as much of the sort of shtick that I absorbed, but I never, and I think it is very important, like if you want to like actually parse an idea out, like you have to go to the source material. Like we always want to just read somebody's take on it on Twitter, or like, you know, a teacher teaches you something about it, and it's no substitute for like actually reading what somebody wrote and just thinking about it on your own, as much as it takes a lot of time, because I think we've seen there's just a million examples of people twisting words, reinterpreting things. Like they have an agenda and they're filtering what they read or hear, and then they're pushing it out to you through the frame of their agenda, and then your impression gets
this
colored.
is like a perfect example of that.
I have some notes on his like earlier days before he published it.
Yeah. Just give some quick bullet points, because he this man was no like just random crazy homeless psychopath guy.
I think it sets up the why we want to talk about his ideas a little more outside of his like, you know, terrorist actions. But I mean, as a kid, he was like off the charts intelligent. So he'd take an IQ test at the time because he was so smart. They were curious, and he ranked up there with Einstein and Hawking. And I think at the age of 16, he enrolled in Harvard for a mathematics major. And he went on from there. He got his MBA, or not his MBA, but his master's and PhD. He wrote like a PhD in some geometrics functions. I mean, it was a pretty dense mathematics thing, but I mean, it got accolades from his colleagues and his peers, and it won best math dissertation of the year. And then he was like, I think one of the youngest math professors at Berkeley. This is at age 25. So this is like us 12 years ago, he's like quite accomplished in his career, mathematics professor at Berkeley. And then in 1969, he just quits. And that's when things start to shift. He moves to a house in the woods in Montana, no electricity, no running water. And people say that's when he became a madman. But also some people say his time at Harvard, he could have became a madman because he was part of some experiments that were pretty traumatic.
Yeah, was he a part of the MK Ultra stuff?
So his professor had some connection to the MK Ultra experiments, and that's where they fed people, drugs to see if they could be used to mind
LSD.
control. Yeah, LSD. But part of that was not just the drugs; it was a direct and intense psychological bashing. And so I think the experiment they had him do was, hey, write about your view of the world. And then they consistently and intensely psychologically abused him to the point, like, why would you write that? And people think that, like, maybe that's the point he kind of turned and became a madman. I think he's quoted as saying, like, it didn't have that much effect on me. But he did describe it as, like, one of the worst experiences of his life. So it's notable that he had an MK Ultra-ish.
Yeah, sounds like fucking Guantanamo or something.
Yeah, it wasn't physical torture. But anyway, I think that context is important when kind of we start to get into this manifesto. Another thing is he wrote this and we're going to talk about his view on technology and its impact on society. But I think it's important to know.
95, right?
95.
Well, hold on. It was released to the Washington Post in 95.
Right.
But these ideas were built over a long period of time.
Yeah. So in that time it was published, the internet was at its infancy. Computers were not in every home.
There was social media, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. And like the cell phones were, Michael Douglas Wall Street
No
style.
cell phones, basically.
Like huge, yank out the antenna. Like TV and radio were the mainstream. So no YouTube, no podcast, no messaging platforms. And this guy, as we'll talk about, had some pretty clear views of how technology will impact society. And they might have come true. But it's crazy that he even had these ideas before...
I think it's
technological society is as we know
it. It's clear that the ideas came true. Yeah. I want to know what you guys feel about the after effects.
Well, do you think that? Do you want to give like a
summary,
or like a brief? We just go like 10,000 foot view.
All right, I give like
a
few bullet points on like key points of the manifesto.
Yeah.
So one is this technological progress, this revolution of technology, creates social and psychological problems for the human psyche. He argues it rips at the human soul, that it causes things like depression, it causes feelings of powerlessness and hostility. So that's one.
And even before that, I think like he starts off with a sort of perspective on like what creates like human fulfillment.
Oh, you're talking about the power cycle, or the power process?
The power process, is that what he calls it?
I mean, he almost invoked almost like a Tony Robbins. Like he was saying that like humans inherently have this thing called the power process, in which you set goals, you take actions to set goals, and you have agency to accomplish those goals. And he said that like just like a dog, Milo, who has this innate desire to chase things and hunt them down, and just we have that same kind of innate desire to do. And when and then as he's going on to these other arguments, he's saying that the technological progression and the bureaucracy and authoritarian, tendencies it brings on us, it clamps that down. So yeah, he introduced this framework called the power process. You could describe it like a personal development thing, or just like I think he describes it as a innate thing of like human psychology. He goes on to talk about like how technology erodes freedom. And I think the best way to summarize this bullet point is he says that some of these ancient authoritarian civilizations, the individuals there almost had more freedom than we do today because they didn't have all the tools and technology to monitor, manage, and kind of control potentially.
Well, backing up one step too,
Yeah.
I think his idea was a lot of this power process, like a lot of these goal setting and accomplishment was rooted around like ideas of like survival and thriving. And I think he sort of said that like there are elements of technology that sort of rob us of that in a particular way, and thus like rob us of that like essential power process, right?
Right. Like if we don't throw the ball to Milo, he doesn't get that feeling of like chasing something down, grab it, bringing it back to the tribe, And I think he's kind of saying that like we're not throwing the ball to the humans anymore. They don't have anything to run and chase, and it goes back to that survival instinct, and it's being compressed and suppressed. He talks about this thing called over-socialization.
Yeah, that's a really
Holy
interesting
shit.
thing.
We'll talk about that one, but
yeah.
essentially he's talking about what we call on this podcast like wokeism. Maybe I'll go a little further and interject my own views, but wokeism, or just like a mind virus on how
wokeism is the left version of his over-socialization,
Right.
but it's not like a uniquely left phenomenon.
Right.
But it is very prevalent, I think, in society today. We'll talk about it more later, but like that one was a real like, whoa.
And then I just had 2 more points, which is his solution is that societal collapse is necessary. And this is where maybe we all start to diverge away from him, is that he thinks like pure upheaval is necessary. And then there's another part where he's like, we need to return to nature. And he kind of lives this out because he's out in the woods in Montana, like living on his own, living off the land. But in general, he's saying that like humans need to be in nature, and they should be, and it provides good psychological needs. He talks about how urbanization and crowding people together does something to the psyche that's not healthy long term. So I don't know. Those are like the 5 or 6 bullet points.
Yeah, there's one more bullet point I would put in there. Is this concept of surrogate activities.
Yeah. I loved that too. It was sort of in that like power process. It's like a part of the power process, but
so without the power process, there are other things that you do to sort of seek fulfillment there. Like when the technological state sort of robs you of your individual autonomy and your kind of base need to go survive and conceive of, pursue, and accomplish goals, humans substitute other activities to derive this meaning.
Like getting
work,
good at
hobbies.
Imagine getting good at pickleball.
Causes.
Like this is like a fully autonomous thing. This is like all on me. Like I want to get good at pickleball, and this is like outside the scope of like primitive life.
Well, I obviously thought about pickleball when I read this. And I was
thought
like,
about
that's
thought
like
about all of mine.
That's what I'm doing here. I'm substituting
Yes.
some more deep, meaningful, like kind of survival or base human instinct thing with this other activity.
Exactly.
So yeah, that was a really eye-opening thing to me. I mean, I'm trying to think where we should take this to start. Like, do you have anything that let's just like? Did anything like super jump out at you?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you guys like, what was your just overarching response? Because when I first read this thing, and granted I only got like 2/3 of the way through, but when I first read this thing, I was like, this is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever encountered in my entire life.
Because of its predictive value, or because of like the way he structures arguments?
It's structured in a very
I think it's the rhetoric, the
logical
structure, but I also think it's just like just the ideas themselves are correct. You know, like and again, I'm separating the merit of the ideas from the merit of the man. But I did combine those again at a later point. But like I think the merit of the ideas are sound.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like he rationalized his killing, saying that like, well, my manifesto he probably was thinking my manifesto will be read if it's from a serial killer, and if I just publish it on its own. And that's where
what's interesting is in the manifesto he doesn't really like call other people to direct violence or anything. He doesn't even have like a specific prescription. Like he makes some observations about the technological state. Like one of them is that it is so pervasive and inevitable that like the idea that we can moderate it in some sort of way is foolhardy. Like
he mentions specifically, I forget, it's like, I don't know, paragraph 120 something, but it's kind of what Kevin Kelly
keep in
was
mind
saying.
This is like mid-90s. This is way before big tech. Like big tech doesn't even exist yet.
Internet
Like,
is
there's no internet. Yeah, like it's like we're still like the radio is still a thing.
He talks about it like Kevin Kelly does, the inevitability of it, the progress of it. That he argues that it only moves forward, and to him that's a threat because you know technology only progresses, and to him he's like that's scary. Kevin Kelly's like, well, that's optimistically good.
Yes, I feel like that's just the opposite side of the same coin.
Right.
One's an optimist and one's a pessimist. Did you guys have that same response though when you read this? You were just like, "Holy shit, this is good," or like, was that a uniquely me thing?
Well, you know how we've brought up certain things in the topics. Were like, I think at one point we brought up a stat like teenage girls have reached all-time highs of depression. Suicide is kind of like out of the norms for that age group, and we've kind of said, there is this something about social media where you're constantly comparing yourself to everyone. There is this impact on the psyche it has. And I felt like he had this answer for that specific
he had that
case.
answer for that no one else had described to me, even in the 40 years since.
Right.
I think he just sort of nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, we were texting back and forth, and I think you might have even used the word almost prophetic, right? Like in terms of...
Yeah, this thing reads like it was written yesterday. And again, like you have to think about how much the world has progressed technologically since this was created. I think some of the stuff he says, like you might take it for granted, but at the time it was like, that's not a thing. And it's not just prophetic and its like kind of view on technology. It's also very prophetic in its view on politics, and with leftism specifically. And the manifesto actually does, like the first thing the manifesto does is kind of like tear into leftism. It's like how the piece basically starts.
Fucking nails it, by the way.
Can you maybe dig into that a little bit for me? Like, can you explain that?
Can I just say, like, as Steven digs into it, I just want to say that I've never felt so seen in my entire life.
When you read it.
When I read this, I was like, thank God somebody fucking said this. And it was 40 years ago.
Yeah, so the glaring oversight here that people are going to think listening to this is that, like, well, this guy sounds kind of like a far-right fascistic guy. He's just kind of mailing bombs. And it's like, and I think that is true. It's definitely true in the sense of the word. And this paper does not really do any critiques of the right? So I think we can acknowledge that and acknowledge that there are definitely critiques to be had there. Let's just put those aside at the moment. It doesn't mean that the critiques he has of leftism are not accurate. So this is like a bit of a one-sided thing, but still. The very first thing he writes in the paper about modern leftism is that almost everyone will agree that we live in a deeply troubled society. One of the most widespread manifestations of the craziness of our world is leftism. Wow. That's how he like opens it. Like, so he clearly thinks like this is like a big deal. He's devoting the beginning of the manifesto to this. And again, this is 1990. This is probably like 1993.
What I liked is that he actually defined leftism to his definition. Because
that's a broad umbrella, right? So what did he mean?
Yeah, so I think he delineated. He's like, there are people that are more socialist. There are people who are more this or that. And he's like, I'm specifically talking about the politically correct.
He also even had he also ends the thing with like a little statement like, hey, I'm not talking about all of you guys. I realize you're not all the same. I'm just making a broad statement on average, So, which I thought was kind of funny because he acknowledges that like this isn't literally everybody, but he's talking about
the politically
direction of this sort of, ideology, this segment of left ideology, this far left directionally speaking. And he focuses on that. And like, God, like he had, I don't even know where to begin. Like some of the lines in here are kind of crazy. Like there's a line in here where he talks about the manipulation of language. And the examples he uses are kind of funny at the time, like the words that were being changed. I don't know if you guys have it on you. Like, oh yeah, here. So he's lamenting about like, well, he's like, we can't say broad and chick anymore, even though they're just the feminine equivalents of guy, dude, and fellow. And it's like so he's a bunch of stuff like that. Animal rights activists have gone so far as to reject the word pet and instead on its replacement, animal companion. And I was like, oh man, if you only knew, brother, where
we were headed. I mean, you called this like semantic overload, in the past where they kind of use language to pit people to one side or the other, and if you don't use the right language, you fall on one side or the other of the coin, when that may not and obviously is not true.
It's sort of, I think the semantic overload is like very adjacent to this, but it's like a nuance. It's like when you use a term that is sort of like incomplete in its description, like defund the police. It's like this kind of, it can be interpreted in these two polarizing different ways by two groups, and inevitably they sort of clash over it. Whereas what Kaczynski is talking about here is like the changing of the word homeless to unhoused person, or we're changing the word triggered to something else. We can't say grandfather anymore, or like whatever.
Yeah. All lives
the new
matter.
Flavor of the day is. All lives matter is it's a good example of semantic overload, I think, actually. But he's talking about like the capture of language here, and where's this line? When someone interprets as derogatory almost anything that is said about him or about groups with whom he identifies, we conclude he has inferiority feelings or low self-esteem. This tendency is pronounced among minority rights activists, whether or not they belong to the minority groups whose rights they defend. They are hypersensitive about the words used to designate minorities and about anything that is said concerning minorities.
Wow.
So he's like calling out.
He wrote this in the 80s, I'm pretty sure. I know.
So he's basically calling out
so.
like white, upper class, privileged, liberal people who are getting like triggered. This is like the early innings of
and he
people
calls out
becoming
fucking
triggered
university professors too.
Right.
That was the example he used.
But this is like what we see happening now. Like the most extreme
Absolutely.
example of this happening now is obviously in like the whole trans thing, right? Where you're now like the people are so charged over particular words that people are having their Twitter account deleted by saying like, I don't know, with that like the J.K. Rowling thread something. It says something like women are not men. Or men are not women. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, J.K. Rowling was pretty base too.
So now we're at like the far extreme of that sort of thing he's talking about here in like the modern culture wars. And like again, like nothing like this was happening at the time, really. Like this just entered like the zeitgeist like a couple of years ago.
No, it's incredibly
it's kind of
prescient.
crazy,
amazing. Like honestly, this was like for me, this was an edge case. Like this thing's long, right? So like. There are many examples in here of his sort of prescience, but like, I don't know if I'm like jumping the gun, but like, honestly, for me, like I look at what is his main point.
Yeah.
So the way he ties like the whole leftism thing in with everything is through this idea of over socialization.
Yes. Let's get into that.
You talked about, which actually is kind of like a difficult thing to parse out, and I actually came across like many blogs on blogs like actually debating what the hell that actually means and different people's like interpretations of it. But there's this idea that when you're sort of like socialization is this like broad spectrum, right, where you sort of are like internalizing to a degree some ideas of norms or morality or what you're supposed to be doing like within society, right? And in like a base state, there's this sort of baseline and and everything is fine. And I'm speaking like really high level here. When over socialization starts happening, you start elevating some elements of what is defined as a good or moral, like far above the others to the point where this becomes like super out of whack. And then like everybody is like all in on one particular institution's definition of what is good or moral. And this to me was like, wow, that's what's happening today. And like
that's what the box I feel like I live in now.
I agree with you both. I still think this is missing the main point, but I'm happy to continue going down this path because I thought it was fascinating.
What do you?
No, I think it's fascinating. Let's continue.
Yeah.
I was recently listening to the Untethered Soul audiobook.
Amazing book.
Where the guy strips down all of your being into a place where it's like you're just the watcher, okay? That's all you are. Like I think where I came to with the Untethered Soul is like you basically learn how to be obedient in a society to like act in an acceptable way. And that becomes your sort of socialization. And I think he's saying the same thing. He's like, we call a kid well-adjusted if the kid can act to our sort of like obedient standards.
Right. And I kind of thought of that originally in just kind of more traditional terms, like you should get a job. You should buy a house. Like you need to be married by a certain age. Like I thought of those as like maybe that's what he was thinking at his time because he wasn't facing these kind of like more cultural divides that we have now. I don't know,
was
maybe
thinking more idiosyncratic where you're like, you want the kid to shake your hand and look you in the eye and say, hello, nice to meet you, sir. You know, like that bullshit. Like all of this is like the level of obedience that is sort of
but it's on a spectrum. Like that's why it's like complicated to discuss because there are some norms or goods of society that are normal and there's some balance between those and the relative weights you give to them and which you accept and which are inside or outside the Overton window. It's like a bit of a messy idea, right? But it obviously can go to the extreme. There's a couple of quotes actually that I think would maybe kind of illustrate what he's saying. So one of the direct quotes from him in this is the moral code of our society is so demanding that no one can think, feel, and act in a completely moral way. For example, we are not supposed to hate anyone, yet almost everyone hates somebody at some time or another, whether he admits it to himself or not. Some people are so highly socialized that the attempt to think, feel, and act morally imposes a severe burden on them. In order to avoid feelings of guilt, they continually have to deceive themselves about their own motives and find moral explanations for feelings and actions that in reality have a non-moral origin.
Wow.
And I think the way he ties this in is like, so to focus on the leftists, right? Because that's what he's focusing on here. He would say that technology and these elements of society have like stripped people of this sort of base sense of meaning and power that they have, and they feel sort of insecure and like disempowered. And like in this paper, he argues like so specifically like there's this kind of like liberal tendency, or well, let's keep calling it leftist because I don't want to lump everybody in here, but like let's think of like the extremes, tendency to like fight for things like climate change, social justice, right? And his argument in this paper that he puts forth is that these people are not doing this because they genuinely care about that cause or those people. They're sort of doing it to sort of recapture a lost element of power status that they used to have. This is actually an argument that do you guys know Shelby Steele by any chance? Shelby Steele is super interesting, like one of the 6 like black Republicans on earth. He's a brilliant writer. He's like Thomas Sowell, kind of. Okay. I put him like A tier behind the Thomas Sowell S tier. He has a book called White Guilt. That's like a really interesting book where he talks about how like a lot of like what we see is like this sort of like white yuppie elite liberals kind of like fighting for racism. They're not doing it because they genuinely care about that. They're doing it because they lost some elements of like their power structure, and doing this allows them to put themselves back into a virtuous position, i.e. like regain power, right? And this is this compensation he's talking about, right?
We call that virtue signaling now, right?
I think there's an element of this that is true, right? I don't think everybody does this. I think a lot of people genuinely care about stuff. But like what rubs me the wrong way when I see these people advocating for some of the climate stuff, for the social justice, like it just feels like it's a power play to me. It feels, and I feel like a lot of people feel this way. Like they don't necessarily feel like they're advocating for the causes. They're like sort of advocating to put their foot on your neck in a particular way. Like they want to be above you in the power structure. And in this like paper, he actually specifically, he makes a very nuanced argument about race where he's like, if you really care, I'm paraphrasing Kaczynksi, but he's like, if you really cared about alleviating like racial tensions and making like Black America rise up, you wouldn't be taking these techniques that you do, because what you're doing is like creating more racial tension, and you're actually increasing the pervasiveness of racism in that particular way. Again, 1993, this like played out, I think, especially in the Obama years and the Michael Brown. It's sort of continued ever since, where we keep getting more and more and more sort of militant actions from the climate people, from the social justice warriors, and it's having this reverse effect where the problem isn't being solved because of that. But his perspective is, well, the point isn't to solve the problem. The point is to elevate these people so they can recapture some lost sense of purpose.
I agree with you, and basically I agree with him, and all of his points are salient, but I think we're still not talking about his fundamental point. His actual point is that, well, I think there's a couple things here. One is that the mainstream sort of understanding of his point is, first of all, wrong. The mainstream understanding of his point is saying that like reject technology, that's bad, nature good. I think that's what sort of like the LA Times would report as his point. I don't think that's his point at all. I think his point is modern society is bad, and that people are left unfulfilled because the nature of our modern reality has changed what he calls power process. And I think we should be talking more about this power process.
And so are you?
I agree with what you're saying, and what he's saying is that he's using this as an illustration to show you the manifestation of what happens. I think when people lose these kind of base things, but I agree with you that his like first point is
let's talk about the power process, because everything else is examples leading to this, right? Like, do you guys agree that like in that a basal human need, like you described Milo's need to chase the ball,
right,
is to have a goal, put forth effort towards that goal, and then attain that goal to give yourself fulfillment. And that is like a human version of fetching that ball.
Yeah, because I mean, you think about our society, like how long has the human species been around? And then you look at the last like couple hundred years, and we've significantly advanced technology and civilization to the point where like he talks about how like our physical needs are all met. And you take that, pre-programmed software that we had in our head, which is built around survival, and you put it in this world where the survival basis are kind of taken care of, and you like tamp out this fire that, and maybe we're more speaking from I don't know if this matters whether it's male or female, but there is this like innate desire to hunt and achieve and like provide that you don't really get.
So then
now.
Did you agree?
Now we literally, my DoorDash is late.
Yeah,
like I'm pissed.
So did you agree with, he had this framework where he said that goals exist within these three categories. One is a goal that's easily achievable with low effort, one that is achievable with high effort, and one that is not achievable under any circumstance. Okay? He describes this, and he says that in primitive society, most of these goals are the second category. Like, you are going to go hunt for food, you have to go try, and that's a bitch. Like, that's a hard thing to do.
You may fail to 20%,
like,
30%
to go
of the
eat
time.
is a fucking hard thing, right? But then modern society has sort of pushed these category 2s into category 1s and 3s, I think, is what his point was.
It's been this kind of pushing, everything's a 1 and a 3.
Everything's a 1 and 3. So to eat, you just walk down to the store, no problem.
Click a few buttons on your phone.
You got a button now.
Oh, yeah, you don't even walk down to the store. You get DoorDash. Right, so that's a category 1.
He would have loved DoorDash.
Do you remember the category 3s? I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about, and you're kind of directionally correct. I want to try to find it in here. I'll let you know if I can find it, but it's sort of what you said.
And what is like the ultimate effect of not having these goals where, I guess we had in more survival times? Like,
oh, hold on. Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
I found category 3. He says, thus the power process is disrupted in our society through a deficiency of real goals and a deficiency of autonomy in the pursuit of these goals. But it's also disrupted because of the human drives that fall into group 3. Our lives depend on whether safety standards at a nuclear power plant are properly maintained, which is outside of our control, or on how much pesticide is allowed to get in our food, or how much pollution is in our air outside of our control, or on how skillful or incompetent our doctor is, or whether we lose our job because some government economist or some corporate executives have decided that like the economy is not favorable. So this is all outside of our hands. So he calls this like the pushing of the level 2 category into level 3, where no matter what effort we can push forth, we can't control our own outcomes, because like the level 1 is I can like DoorDash food to my bed, or I don't even have determination on my own security because
or my survival, my economic.
Yeah, it's all pushed to this level 3.
Oof.
That I think this to me is the crux of the manifesto as it pertains to today, and like the fact that we don't have any level 2 anymore in our modern society is leaving people unfulfilled. I think that's like where we land.
Well, 34 in this, I think, kind of describes like what's happened. It's like the transition point of society, like that we're at right now. Because consider the hypothetical case of a man who can have anything he wants just by wishing for it. Such a man has power, but he will develop serious psychological problems. At first, he will have a lot of fun, but by and by, he will become acutely bored and demoralized. Eventually, he may become clinically depressed. History shows that leisured aristocracies tend to become decadent. This is not true of fighting aristocracies that have had to struggle to maintain their power, but leisured, secure aristocracies that have no need to exert themselves usually become bored, hedonistic, and demoralized. And like when I hear that, that like sounds like the younger generation.
Yes.
They sound bored, hedonistic, and demoralized. They can have everything they want.
Scrolling on social media, high porn use. You know,
hold on.
I mean,
this is actually. I want to talk about this because this is now we're talking about the crux of his argument. When we have a dearth of like this like category 2 goals, he then brings in this idea of autonomy. Now, and he calls them what's that term he used? He calls surrogate activities. So surrogate activities are things you do when you don't need to actually like search for like real shit. Like if you don't need to search for food or build shelter or whatever.
Like Milo, his surrogate activity is chasing the ball because he's not hunting anything.
Exactly. So he like aptly describes surrogate activities as like, I think like a modern definition would be like, all right, well, we can start a YouTube channel and get more subscribers or whatever. And these are like, you know, like we can have a Twitter following.
Are we doing it right now?
Yeah. Like, I think these are surrogate activities by his definition, which will not lead you to the same type of fulfillment that, you know, like a primitive sort of lifestyle will lead you to when that shit is earned.
Did you guys get any like flavors of flow state when he talked about this power process? Because like flow state, you know, can be described like it's like a perfect, when you're designing a game, it's not too hard to accomplish and it's not too easy where you get bored, but there's this little channel where like in a game, it's just like you reach this flow state, and that game could be an actual game or it could be in life or it could be in your work. You know, did you guys, I got like shadows of that from his power process. Like you can't have these things that are so unattainable and things that are too easy. You want a life in which, you know, it's challenging but accomplishable in that. And he's saying that's like completely devoid in our life now. We've created new games for ourselves to make us feel that.
I think we've like neglected the autonomy portion a little bit because in our modern life, what we tend to do is like we are a cog in the societal wheel, right? We haven't talked about this yet, but I think this is a big part of it. So as a member of this like larger, you know, society, you will do your job and you'll be obedient to that job. And if you are more obedient than the other guy, then I'll give you even a promotion or I'll give you a raise. I think that is another crux that he's talking about, where it's like you're losing this autonomy. I think he calls it his like fourth component of the power process. But like the more I see it, he's not talking about technology. He's not talking about nature. He's talking about humans losing their nature.
Right.
And I think we're losing our nature in our desire to be autonomous and to go through this power process.
Okay, so here's where I started to get a little lost, because he's talking about like a return to primitive lifestyle. And I'm like, okay, you could be right in that, but is it a practical, pragmatic solution without, you know, millions and tens of millions of lives getting worse off, essentially?
So you're leading toward a conclusion, and I like it because I have this like way that I feel now about this motherfucker. Okay?
Yeah.
One, I don't think he's right about that.
Right. The solution.
The solution is wrong. Like you don't just go backwards. I don't think it can go backwards. It's like Kevin Kelly. Like it doesn't go backwards. And my thought is that this stupid motherfucker would have actually benefited from modern technology. Like if he could have taken this manifesto and published it on Twitter or come on goddamn YouTube with Alfalfa, he could have discussed these things in normal, natural terms without fucking bombing people. But he actually, I'm pissed off. He actually took the fucking shortcut that he admonishes in the beginning, and he calls everybody victims because they don't fucking do the hard work. I'm like, you bitch, you little bitch, you actually held everybody under your thumb and made us read this under duress.
Of opening your mailbox.
Saying, I will kill you if you don't read this. And I'm like, you fucking little pussy. Why wouldn't you do the hard work too? Become an author, get published, get distribution. You son of a bitch. Like, we would have fucking listened to you, but now you're just this babbling fucking lunatic.
Yeah, and your ideas get lost along with
It's fucked up. I'm pissed off. I'm pissed off at him. He killed people.
It is a weird thing. Like, imagine like he's like a heaven. God's like, oh, you wrote this paper. That was brilliant. That's brilliant. He's like, yeah. So I killed a bunch of people so that people would read it. And he's like, wait,
instantly
what?
undermine your whole.
He literally killed people for marketing. This fucking tool.
Yeah.
Fucking bitch.
Well, can you maybe open up a little bit that now there is a younger generation, maybe our generation, but certainly younger than our generation, that is removed from the actual real-time terrorism of it, who didn't live under his thumb, as you say. They didn't experience the fear or like the fantasism about like how he captured the country. This guy just was bombing people every year and no one could capture him. Like, there's a generation that is removed from the pain part of this, but his ideas still exist. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm just saying now,
right.
Now, from this point in this timeline moving forward,
you're saying the ends justify the means.
No, I'm not.
I'm just teasing.
I'm clearly
I'm
not.
teasing you, yeah.
Yeah.
For the record, Nick is not saying that the ends justify the means.
But feel free to roast me in the comments. Please do. But there is a generation younger than us that is kind of like liking his comments. There's like a Zoomer TikTok generation, which is so ironic
the
because
content of his message is fucking rad. I mean, it's one of the best things I've ever read.
Yeah, I mean, I do say his diagnosis portion.
Well, they're one of the first generations to fully grow up and live in this sort of what he would probably call technological hellscape that like he just thought about, right? Like, now the kids born today, they're just born into this world. And it is interesting to see that there are these kind of backlash pockets forming. Like, there's like, have you seen like the trad wife movement on TikTok? Like, there's this segment.
Is this the Luddite thing?
No, there's this like segment of like Zoomer TikTokers who are like really into the traditional wife. Like, they make videos. They look like 50s housewives talking about how they love gender roles and they want to take care of their husband and have a bunch of kids. And it's super interesting because you think that, well, each generation is going to go more and more and more and more, but it's actually like a rubber band in some ways that stretches, and then like certain people snap and they go back the other way. And I think we sometimes think it's going to go just linearly in one direction forever, but actually one of the interesting things about humanity is that like each generation does this sort of like seesaw thing where they test out going too far one way and maybe they overcorrect back too far the other direction, but sort of maybe over time directionally they're getting to a better place. So it's like interesting to see like it come full circle, and now you have like Gen Z or Gen Alpha or whoever's like making this, and they're starting to just sound like your grandparents and some of the things they say.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting because there's an older generation that would claim that like, well, Trump is our way of like, you know, rebounding back. But this Gen Z is picking up some of his ideas, and I find it ironic that they're using TikTok to like distribute the ideas that he's talking about, even though he like would abhor TikTok as like a social mechanism.
It's like that meme of like the girl on the laptop with like the smash capitalism and Marxist logos like on her
Apple laptop,
iMac,
and at Starbucks.
I'm not done ranting, I think.
Keep going, because like I think you're kind of nailing it.
I'm pissed off at him still because
preach, brother.
He opens his whole fucking diatribe with he's lamenting this like victim mentality. Doesn't he feel like a little bit of a victim mentality? Like, to me, it does. It's like, well, society's broken, but no one will listen to me, so I'm gonna fucking have to do these bombings. So someone will listen to me. It's like, fuck you, you little bitch.
Yeah.
No, fucking.
I mean, he even, I think one of his victims was like an advertising executive, you know, where, you know, he could have like done the work to market his.
Yeah, maybe get yourself a little self-esteem, you little bitch, like you just talked about.
Yeah, exactly. He could have done the work to spread his word. And actually, I mean, it was easier then. than it is now, arguably, because there's a handful of outlets.
They're looking for content.
Well, actually, like one of the ironies here, I don't know if it's ironic, might be ironic, is that, so he talks about when he wrote this, there's this idea that we talked about that technology is sort of stripping away your individual autonomy. And Eric talked about the idea that no matter what you do, like whatever happens at the nuclear plant, you're dependent on all these other things, right?
Yeah.
He lived in a time of like when that was peak for like media. But actually, if like he lived today, like he would probably just have a TikTok or a YouTube channel.
He probably have about 70,000 followers.
He could have actually used technology to re-empower himself in a way that had been previously stripped out by the technology.
And he's talking about tech as this bad thing when that's exactly what he needed. That is the irony.
So maybe like his conception that tech is this one-way thing that just goes and goes and goes is actually not correct. Maybe it is this circular thing that comes back around. Like maybe maybe tech actually doesn't just go full dystopia, but maybe it actually comes all the way back around and like re-empowers people. Like I wonder if he would think about crypto. Like crypto is like a good example of that. Like technology
disintermediating.
Like, yeah, and now we've come full circle. And now we've totally disintermediated money.
You know, I'm a bit of like an empath at times, and I felt for this guy as well. And one thing I felt for him was like, I wish he was around at a time that we were around, because like our community, the Alfalfa community, fucking accepts and encourages takes like this.
Right.
And we would have fucking been an ear to bend. We would have listened. We would have like given feedback. Like I think he would have been much happier talking to our team than fucking bombing randoms.
You know, you just made me think, like, I was like, well, who are those voices now? Like he was a voice of the past because he's been in a supermax prison for, since the 90s. But who are those voices now that like maybe we don't elevate enough? You mentioned we're gonna do a little goat thing, but like maybe we should do like a goat quotes, like goat Thomas Sowell quotes. Like he's someone who's living now, who writes books. The guy will not get on a fucking podcast to save his life or to save his message. But maybe we do a little goat thing of Thomas Sowell. Quotes.
I'm always in favor of Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, you're the one who introduced him to us in the first place.
Big fan. Everybody read him. Read all his stuff.
Anything else you
I want to just wrap it up because I feel like we've glossed over like his generalized take on technology and technological process, so I think his observations of leftism are very astute and pretty spot on. I think his observation or his predictions of what happens when people sort of get disempowered in society and latch onto all these other things and sort of like externalize their self-esteem or their sense of purpose. Like, I think all spot on. I'm not convinced that society would be better if we all just went back to like a agrarian time where we had like 13 kids living on a farm. I will say he does point out, he does kind of create this nuance in technology. He creates this like divide in technology where there's technology is okay. Like he's not like completely anti-technology. He's okay technology when it can be used in a like personal sphere to like enhance your life, and he's anti it when it's sort of like externalized. So like an example of this would probably be like Facebook is a good example of technology that like not going to help you in the backwoods. It's not just, it's this externalized thing and it's oppressive to your life. And I think that's actually accurate in a lot of senses, although I'm sure there's some good that comes of it as well. Versus like he's not like anti like a gun,
right? Like or like a hatchet to chop down a tree.
Like he's not anti like tools.
But he was like he didn't have electricity or running water in his like house in Montana.
That's true.
I don't know if by choice.
That's true. That's true. Maybe not by choice. I wonder like if he would like hate the iPod or something. Like, I don't know. Maybe that would like cost
write better.
But like, I don't know what the prescription is. I definitely see a lot of his point that technology has definitely harmed society in a lot of ways, but like it's obviously also made a lot of elements of society really good. Like in terms of just like the raw number of humans who are able to survive now, like much higher than it used to be. I think more, even though people are demoralized now, if you want to, say that that's true. And I would say there are a lot of demoralized people now, but they're not dying. So that's an improvement. Right?
We're living hopefully longer.
Yeah. And he does open up the idea that there's these two endpoints. There's the full technological dystopia, but he like actually opens this idea that, well, there could be this actual merging of technology and nature. It's funny. I see. It reminds me of this. Like, do you know Scott Lewis, the founder of Kanto?
Yes.
He always posts this like photo of this like super high tech city, but it's like embedded in this forest and surrounded by mountains and birds, and it's like this like AI generated photo of hyper technology merged with nature.
Avatar.
Yeah, it's like Avatar, basically. So maybe like that's where we're going. Like I don't know if I buy this idea that we have to like the world would be better off if you just tore down everything. I do think people would be happier in a lot of ways. I do think there's this truth to the idea that you go out to these African tribes and you talk to them and they're all just like happy and fulfilled fine. And yeah, we're good. But you don't have like TV and they're like, I mean, I don't care.
I do find the manifesto empowering in the sense that if you had this feeling or this urge or this anxiety, like the guy put language to it, which empowers you to recommunicate it to your friends and your family and like when these things come up so that the good parts of what he provided can kind of survive and maybe provide better arguments in the future. So I don't know. I find that like a little bit empowering that he found a way of putting it that I hadn't found myself, and in a way that I can like copy and paste it and put it in, in other conversations. Hopefully.
I guess that's where I want to leave it. It's like based on reading this, have you like changed your behaviors? Like, do you have a desire to change your behaviors based on this? Like, I think we can all agree that technology is not going to go backwards.
Right. And so like you made the best point that like technology is a part of his argument, but it's not the point you should take away. It's the modern society, maybe the over socialization part and what happens when a human is like trapped in this moral code in which it's almost impossibly purely moral and you're constantly against this impossible test. And I think the words that he puts are empowering in order to kind of butt up against that when these like moral warriors go at you in a hostile way, here is language that's like your weapon in a tool to combat that if it ever does arrive at your doorstep.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, we are a pretty pro technology group. This is a pretty pro technology podcast.
You think you'd like the Apple Vision Pro?
I don't think he would like that at all. But yeah, I think
until he jerked off in it.
I think,
and then he's like, "Well, this guy can stay."
Hold on.
I think we do a good job as a group of friends of like balancing these things. Like we love technology and we embrace stuff, and I think we are generally optimistic. But we've also done stuff like the dopamine detox, and we're like kind of iffy on stuff like porn and like we see like. There's this mixture of stuff happening here. Like there are good things happening in technology, but like also like we have to be like self-aware of it and what it does to us. And I think like we can take these steps via self-awareness to like mitigate this, but it's hard on a societal level. Like I do think the over-socialization thing is a big thing. I do think that's like the root of a lot of the political strife we see happening right now. Like people have like elevated these specific institutions and what they hold up at the cost of others, and there's this divide, and bad things are happening as a result of that. But yeah, I think we need to all just kind of be more self-aware and take personal agency for what we're doing. I don't want to be a Luddite.
No. So we have a greater group of us. Like it's not just us four. We have a broader group of friends. Would you send the manifesto to like a buddy?
Absolutely.
Okay, and what would you say?
Read this.
But would you caveat it?
No,
I'd say it to a buddy today, and he called me like almost immediately.
I'd say it's like one of the best things I've ever read.
Maybe
like,
semi-concerned.
Yeah, like why are you sending me the Unabomber's Manifesto? Are you okay?
Well, like, do you guys actually feel like the content is just like without merit? Because I think the content is fucking phenomenal.
The content has tons of merit. There's stuff that's wrong with it. I think it's not a perfect thing, but I think there is stuff there that you shouldn't ignore, and it's possible to separate the art from the art. I don't want to say the art from the artist. That sounds terrible, but it's possible to separate. I was just thinking of Michael Jackson. It's possible to separate this from other stuff. It's possible to look at things in kind of parse and compartmentalize.
You have to compartmentalize, yeah, totally.
Sometimes that's not doable, but I think in cases like this, it It totally is.
I'm imagining in a non-Twitter account that kind of like basically just tweets out comments of his.
Okay, so
and like
hold on, so
spreading the word without the extra baggage.
So like I want to continue with this game you're playing.
Yeah.
Because I actually think that there's more to it. So you send this to your buddy and you say maybe something along the lines of what I said, like this is one of the best things I've ever read. But then how do you close the loop? Like closing the loop to me would be like, okay, so we should modify our behavior as X, Y, or Z. I don't think well, first of all, I only read 2/3 of his thing, so I don't know if it concluded in a way that suggested we should change. But like, I don't know that like even reading the 2/3 where I'm like, well, I know that I should change in a certain way. It was just eye opening in how like prophetic this thing was.
I think the diagnosis of the problems is just as powerful as a solution, because when you're aware that you're tense or anxious or jealous, whatever the emotion is, like the awareness is almost like, half the battle. Like, what is it? Like one of those 13 steps of like addiction, like admit that you have an addiction. Acknowledge of it. So like maybe just, getting armed with the diagnosis of like, why do I feel this is not right? Or this movement or that movement doesn't feel like it's actually speaking rationally. And I don't know. I think that diagnosis is powerful.
It's enough.
It's enough.
Well said. All right. I think we'll wrap it there. If you want to continue this discussion, we are talking about it in the Discord as we speak. I was late for this podcast because I was talking about it. Really interesting stuff. Glad I have people to discuss this with instead of all the other people in my life who would shun me.